Hey, today we're in part 2 of this series I'm so excited about. We call it David, primarily because I couldn't come up with a better title. And we're studying the life of who would eventually become King David, perhaps ancient Israel's greatest king. And as we jump into this story today, we're going to be reminded of something that is relevant to all of us, either in this moment, in this season of your life, or it will certainly be relevant at some point in the future. And here's what we're going to discover: that the ways of God are most unappealing and seemingly irrelevant when we are angry, isolated, or afraid. That the ways of God, and if you're a Christian, then it's the God of the New Testament. If you're not a Christian, maybe you just have a concept of God, or maybe you're just a theist in general. But however you define that the ways of God, however you see that, are most unappealing, and they seem the most irrelevant. It just seems like, why would anybody even do this? Why would anybody even think this way? When we're super angry, when we're isolated, we're alone, or we're lonely, or we're afraid. These three conditions, and we've all discovered this, these three conditions have the potential to undermine the resolve of even the most dedicated, devout, disciplined person among us. That these three conditions cause us to crash through every moral, have the potential to cause us to crash through every moral and every ethical boundary we set up for ourselves. That these three conditions have the potential to drive us beyond the guardrails we've set up for ourselves relationally, physically, financially, or even professionally. And one of these three, or maybe a combination of these three, are a part of your greatest regret. If you were to stand up and say, I want to tell you about the greatest regret of my life, chances are it was a time when you were super angry and you did something you regret. You were isolated and alone, or perhaps you were just afraid. And unfortunately, one of these three will probably be part of your future regret as well. And the reason is this: when we're a part of those conditions, when we're overwhelmed with the emotions associated with any of those conditions, we feel compelled to do something. You just got to do something. There's almost a sense of panic. I've got to do something to relieve this tension. In fact, you'll do just about anything. Oftentimes we do the wrong thing. We rely on our instinct. We do what we did last time this happened. Or we do what we feel like worked before, or just what comes natural. And as a result of that, things don't get better. Things generally get worse. There's not less regret. There's more regret. Things aren't less complicated. We make our own lives more complicated. We end up angrier, we end up lonelier, and we end up scared-er. Now, to the story of David. David had two colossal failures in his life. Two colossal failures. One he's very famous for that happened in his 50s once he had become king. But the one we're going to talk about today takes place when he was in his 20s. He was only 20, by the time this happens, he was about 22 years old. This is the colossal mess up that he's not famous for, but I think it's one of the most interesting, one of the most dramatic stories in all of the Bible, certainly in all of the Old Testament. Following his defeat of Goliath, and if you weren't here last week or didn't hear last week's message, you should go on the app and watch it to get caught up. But last week, we followed him into the valley of Elah, where he faced Goliath. After he kills Goliath, he becomes the most famous person in Israel. He was 15 years old. 15 years old. Everybody knows his name. They're writing songs about David. He becomes a legend. The king realizes this young man has a lot of potential, but suddenly he has a lot of influence and a lot of power. King Saul was Israel's first king, and he was extraordinarily insecure. So King Saul came up with a plan that might have been a good plan if David hadn't been who David was. He decided to get David into his family so he could control him. So he offers one of his daughters to David in marriage. Now, and David's response is really interesting. He said, I'm not worthy to be the king's son-in-law. And my family is not a famous family or a rich family, so I don't think I'm worthy. And then there was the fact that he was 15 years old. I don't know if that factored in or not. But anyway, so David refuses the king's offer to be the king's son-in-law. And then people are like, oh my gosh, this kid is absolutely amazing. Who would refuse such an offer? What a humble kid. Well, time goes by, and Saul is continuing to look for ways to control David. So David falls in love with one of King Saul's other daughters named Michal. They get married. Then he becomes friends with King Saul's son, Jonathan. And the next thing you know, King Saul realizes that getting this kid into my family was a bad idea because he's so powerful, he's so influential. Everybody loves David, and King Saul is very, very jealous. Well, time goes by. For about 7 years, David is in King Saul's favor, out of King Saul's favor, in King Saul's favor, out of King Saul's favor. On one occasion, maybe actually more than one occasion, King Saul decides, I got to get rid of this kid, and I don't want to do it, so I'll let the Philistines do it. So he would send David on these impossible missions, and David would come back alive and successful, and people love him even more. So this escalated to the point that King Saul had finally had enough, and he discovers that every time he tries to have David secretly arrested, that his own son Jonathan or his own daughter who married David assist him, and he continues to slip between King Saul's fingers, and the frustration builds and builds and builds and builds and builds. And finally, it all culminates one night at dinner. Now, dinner with the king was a big deal. Dinner was the big meal of the day in ancient times, and if you sat or ate at the king's table, that was an extraordinary honor. And David had typically shown up for dinner, but during these last few turbulent years, David kept missing dinner. And every once in a while, King Saul would say to Jonathan, where's David? Where's that? And Jonathan would kind of cover for him. Well, I think he's out doing this or he's doing that. So finally, one night at dinner, the whole family's gathered. It's a big deal. King Saul loses it. And he just explodes. And here's what the text tells us. He says, now get ready for this. This is one of those verses that this is one of those verses that makes me think maybe we shouldn't give children a Bible. Anyway, he says this. Saul's anger flared up at Jonathan. This is at dinner with the whole family sitting there. And he said to him, "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, you." That's pretty strong. And when I read this, I'm thinking, I hope that perverse and rebellious woman wasn't sitting at the table. I mean, how strange would that be? "You son of a perverse and rebellious woman, you. Don't I know that you have sided with the son of Jesse?" So Saul's like, I've had it. I'm tired of pretending. I know that everybody at this table has sided with this shepherd boy against me, the king, the son of Jesse, to your own shame and to the shame, is she in here? That mother who bore you. You just can't leave her out of the equation. I think there were some marriage issues there. Anyway, back in these days, there were always marriage issues because you had too many marriages, They had like favorite wives. You don't want to live in a culture where you have a favorite wife. Anyway, that's a story for another day. Anyway, this goes on. As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, then this is the real issue. Neither you nor your kingdom, because he saw Jonathan as the next king. Saul is the first king of Israel. He sees his son Jonathan, to be the next king. He wants his legacy to last. I mean, he sees his family as part of the future of Israel. "Neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Now send someone to bring him to me. He must die." And then he storms out of the room. Well, Jonathan goes and he finds David, and he says, "David, you got to leave town. In fact, it's worse than that. You got to leave the country. Because my father is not going to rest until you're arrested and until you die. He's too threatened by your reputation. He's too threatened by your influence on this nation." David was 22 years old. And suddenly, he's afraid for his life. He's alone. He's been rejected by the man that he's risked his life for over and over and over. He's feeling rejected by the nation that he's risked his life for over and over and over. And in this particular case, he'd done nothing wrong. So he's abandoned, he's angry, and he's afraid. And he did what many of us do when we're abandoned, angry, and afraid, or afraid. He panicked. He decided to take matters into his own hands. He lost sight of something that it's hard for us to imagine. He lost sight of the fact that God was with him. Because when you read these stories, when you read these narratives, we're 30,000 feet. We know how the story ends. So it's like, why would you do that? Why would you make a decision like that? Why would you panic? Why would you run? Why would you abandon your morals? Why would you abandon your ethics? And I can't help but think there are people who are watching you right now, and they're wondering the same thing. There are people who are watching us right now as we struggle with some of these same things, wondering the same thing. Why would you do that? In fact, let's be honest. You can look back on a season of your own life, now that you have some time and some context, and you ask yourself, why would I do that? Why would I go there? Why would I call him back? Why would I say yes to that invitation? Why did I spend that money? Why did I borrow that money? Why did I just get up and move? Why did I just run away? What was going on? Well, it's real simple. That when you feel abandoned, angry, and afraid, our natural inclination is to panic. And that's what David did. So here's what happened. The text tells us that David went to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest. Now I need to explain this for just a minute. In this time in history, Israel did not own the region around the city of Jerusalem. The city of Jerusalem was not part of Israel at that time. So there wasn't really a capital city. So what happened is the epicenter of Jewish worship was wherever the tabernacle was, or the Ark of the Covenant. And the Ark of the Covenant, or the tabernacle, would be moved around from city to the safest place within the territory that Israel controlled. And at this particular time, it was in a city named Nob. And because the tabernacle was there, the priests were there, and Ahimelech was the high priest at the time. So Ahimelech, when David shows up, Ahimelech trembled when he met him, and he asked, "Why are you alone? Why is no one with you?" Every time David showed up, you heard him coming before he got there. David traveled with 1,000 warriors, personal warriors. Ahimelech had never seen David by himself. And suddenly, David shows up. He's a little nervous, a little disheveled. He's by himself. And, he's looking, and Ahimelech's looking around thinking, okay, what's going on? And David answered Ahimelech, and he lies. Now, David is against lying. I mean, it's one of the top 10. Thou shalt not, fill in the blank. Come on, thou shalt not. Yeah, I mean, he knows this. This is his law. In fact, get this. David at this particular time could walk over to the Ark of the Covenant that supposedly housed the original 10 commandments. I mean, he is in the presence of the original version of thou shalt not lie. He is a Jewish man. He's a man who loves God and writes about God. He's against lying, but David lies. Why does he lie? Because he's afraid. And when you're afraid and you're angry and you're abandoned, when you're lonely, when you feel isolated, so much for the ways of God. And here's what he said. He said, Ahimelech the king sent me on a mission and said to me, no one is to know anything about the mission I am sending you on. So he lies. He says, the reason I'm here by myself is I'm on a secret mission. As for my men, I have men. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place. I mean, that was just so lame, but he's just trying to cover for himself. He didn't have any men. And he's afraid that if he tells the truth, Ahimelech isn't going to help him. And that lie would cost, not David, that lie would cost Ahimelech and his entire family their lives. The story continues. Now then, what do you have on hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find. So now David's here without food and he's hungry, and Ahimelech's thinking, this is just weird. Okay, you're by yourself and you're hungry. The king's son-in-law, the captain of the bodyguard, shows up without any food because he's on a secret mission from the king and his men are hiding somewhere. The priest responded like this. He said, but the priest answered David, I don't have any ordinary bread on hand. However, there is some consecrated bread here. Now, let me explain that real quick. Every Sabbath, the priest would bake very fresh bread, and they would put it on the altar before the Lord. Now, I know this sounds strange to us, but this was their way of honoring God with fresh bread. Lo and behold, the next day they would come back, and God had not eaten any of that bread. So then they would take the fresh bread, and the priest would keep it, and the priest would eat it, but it was considered consecrated bread, which meant you had to be ceremonially clean to eat the bread. So Ahimelech says, well, David, we don't have like any just normal food here because, we're the high priest, but we have consecrated bread, and if you want the consecrated bread, you can have it. So the priest gave him the consecrated bread. So now David has not only lied about why he's there, now he's lied in order to be fed. Which, if you were here last week or if you heard the first part of this series, you have to begin to wonder, what happened to, in you I put my trust, my hope is in you all day long? What happened to that version of David? That in God, you are my refuge and I run to you in time of trouble. What happened to that version of David? And then the story gets so intense. There is so much drama in this next part. And I'm really hoping that in the drama of this next moment, that maybe God would speak to you. David asked Ahimelech, do you have a spear or a sword here? Okay, this is when Ahimelech gets a big clue, like, okay, wait a minute. You're like the most famous warrior in the nation. You show up by yourself. You look like you haven't slept in days. You don't have any food. You don't even have a weapon. Do you have a spear or a sword here? I'm not particular. I haven't brought my sword or any other weapon because the king's mission was so urgent. Now, this is when something that's so amazing happens. This is when we need some background music. This is when somebody kind of needs to tease this out in some kind of, film, because this is amazing. David, catch this, David is virtually transported back in time. David is virtually transported back in time to the very event God used to catapult him into fame. This is the wake-up call moment. This is the, oh my gosh, what am I thinking? Why am I thinking this way? Why am I doing this? Why am I even considering these options? This is his moment. This was the moment when his eyes should have been open. He's asking for a spear. He's asking for a sword. And check this out. The priest replied, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine whom you killed 7 years ago. The Philistine that you killed 7 years ago in the valley of Elah is here. Then this is amazing. Can you imagine the drama? I need a sword, I need a spear, I need any kind of weapon. The only weapon that's here is the weapon that you used to behead a giant the day you became the David that we all know and love and fear. Now, the text tells us that when David beheaded Goliath, that he kept the sword as a souvenir. Who wouldn't, okay? This giant sword. He put it in his tent. But later, out of gratitude to God, he took this sword of Goliath and he dedicated it to God, gave it to the high priest, and basically it was a way of saying, God, I recognize that I did not deliver myself with this weapon. You delivered me, so I want to give back to you this weapon as a reminder that I'm been dependent on you. So there was so much emotion, there was so much significance to the sword of Goliath. And suddenly David is reminded of the afternoon that he did the unthinkable. Can you imagine this? That he brings out that sword and all of those memories come flooding back. That afternoon that he wandered down into the valley of Elah all by himself as a shepherd boy with nothing but a sling. Thousands of men lined up on both sides of the valley. And he stood there in front of a giant. What happened to that clear-eyed, courageous, God-fearing shepherd boy who looked at a giant, a battle-hardened warrior, and said, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. And this day, are you taking notes, Goliath? This day I'm going to strike you down. I'm going to take your head from you. Then I'm going to feed all the carcasses of the host of the Philistines to the birds of the air and the wild beasts of the field, so that the whole world will know there is a God in Israel. And this assembly will know. And those who gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands. What happened to that kid? What happened to the boy that ran toward danger as opposed to away from it? What happened to the poet who wrote these famous words? I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Where's that kid? Where's that faith? Where's that confidence in God? And the answer is fear, anger, loneliness. We know this. These three giants have the potential to cause all of us to forget the defeated giants in our past. These three giants have the potential to undermine our faith in God based on what God has done in the past. But David gets this extraordinary reminder. David is shown a visual aid to remind him of God's faithfulness and God's power. And he misses it. The priest replied, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine whom you've killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. This was the garment that the priest wore when they did their priestly duties. If you want it, take it. There is no sword here but that one. He brings out this sword. Can you imagine? All the memories, all the drama. And surely Ahimelech is thinking, none of this makes sense to me. None of this makes sense to me. And this would be a decision that David would regret for the rest of his life. And it would become, like all of our decisions do, it would become a permanent part of the story of his life. And David said, give it to me. There is none like it. Give it to me. And David takes matters literally into his own hands. He lies, and then he runs away from crazy King Saul. And get this, this is amazing to me, with a sword that was last wielded by a warrior who was defeated by a 15-year-old boy. He should have seen it. He should have remembered. It was just too much to miss. A flawed weapon, a flawed response, with, as we're about to see, a disastrous outcome. But this is where our stories intersect with the story of David, isn't it? There we are, right? When we need God most, oftentimes we are least apt to lean in his direction. When we need God most, we are oftentimes tempted to run away rather than toward. We opt for things that never worked before and didn't get us where we are, and that often lead to regret. And it's so interesting because you've seen this in other people. We can see this in other people so easily. You have friends right now that are making terrible decisions based on anger, based on fear, maybe based on a sense of being abandoned. You see it in them and you're thinking to yourself, you're just going to make it more complicated. You're just going to create more regret. It's so easy to see this in other people. It's almost impossible to see this in the mirror. And here's why. Because you've convinced yourself, like I convinced myself, that my situation is different. My situation is different. You don't understand. That's what David thought. Here's what David thought. He thought what we think. If God were with me, if God were really with me, this wouldn't be happening to me. If God were really with me, this wouldn't be happening to me. And here's one of the things that I've learned through the years as a Christian, as a Jesus follower. Here's something that perhaps you've all experienced. Maybe you just didn't have words for it. It is so easy to trust God when we have nothing to trust Him with and nothing to trust Him for. It is so easy in the early days when there's nothing to trust God with, when you're young and you say, God, I want to know your will for my life. I'll do whatever you want me to do. I'll surrender my life. And you go to camp, or you come forward at a church, or you throw your stick in the fire, you write God a letter, you get that first Bible. It's like, God, I want to give you all of my life. And God's going, well, it's not a lot to give, to be honest, okay? You know, you've got the stuff in your room, and it's not even your car, okay? But yeah, I'll take it. God, I surrender my life to you. It's like you're 12 or you're 15. It's like, okay, I'll take it. But it's not, the point is, it's easy to trust God when we have very little to trust Him with and nothing to trust Him for. When things are going great, I mean, how difficult is it to sing these songs? When things are going great, how difficult is it to show up and serve? When things are going great, how difficult is it to pray prayers and trust God and pray for your friends that are going through difficult times? It's easy to trust God when we have nothing to trust Him with and nothing to trust Him for. But it's harder to trust Him when the things that we value start to slip away. So David takes Goliath's sword. And then, just to show you where this goes, and again, it's easy to be critical of David, but we all have our version of this. Get this. David takes Goliath's sword. He knows he has to leave the country, and guess where he goes? He goes to the land of the Philistines. That's a good move. To show up in the land of the Philistines with Goliath's sword. Not only that, it gets worse. He goes to the city of Gath. Guess who was from Gath? That would be Goliath. It's like, David, and that's why I believe this actually happened. Nobody could make this up. It's so ridiculous. But he's panicking. He's afraid. And so he goes to the Philistines, and he goes to the king of the Philistines, or the leader at the time. He says, I want to join your army. I want to fight for you against my own people. And they're not buying it. They're like, there's no way. You are David. Everybody knows who you are. You slew Goliath, and don't tell us you're not. You're carrying his sword. Well, then David becomes really afraid because now he's surrounded by his enemies. So now what does he do? He pretends like he's insane. Literally, he starts scratching with his nails on the wood. He starts slobbering all over. You should read the Bible. This is all in the Bible. He starts slobbering all over himself, and the king is like, okay, I have enough fools in my court as it is. Get this guy out of here. So David flees the Philistines, and he goes. I mean, this is David. He's 22 years old, and he goes and he lives in a cave because he doesn't know what to do, and he feels abandoned, and he's angry. I mean, he doesn't deserve this, and he's alone. And then finally, maybe this is your moment. Finally, he comes to his senses. And he goes back to his country and he finds another prophet. And he says, I have really messed up. I want to know what God's will is for me. I don't know the Lord's will. Would you seek the Lord on my behalf? Would you give me and provide for me the counsel of God? But the problem is, the damage is done. When David was with Ahimelech, looking for bread and looking for a weapon, there was someone else there as well, a fellow named Doeg. Doeg was actually the chief herdsman for King Saul, and he saw David there. And he overheard the conversations, and he got it wrong, but he got just enough information to be confused enough to make things really look bad for Ahimelech. He goes to King Saul. He says, King Saul, I have located David. I know where he is. He went to Ahimelech, and he went to Ahimelech for advice, and I hate to be the one to tell you this, but the chief priest has sided with your enemy, David. Here's how the conversation went. Doeg tells King Saul, Ahimelech inquired of the Lord for him. That is, David showed up, and Ahimelech went to the Lord to get advice for David. He also gave him provisions, and King Saul, I hate to tell you this, he gave him the sword of the Goliath, the Philistine. In other words, he fed him and he armed your enemy. Well, the king is furious. The text says, then the King Saul, sent for the priest Ahimelech. Go to Nob and bring him to me, and bring all the men of his family who are with the priest at Nob. And they all came to the king. And King Saul said to them, why have you conspired against me and you and the son of Jesse, giving him bread and a sword and inquiring of God for him? In other words, you're in on this. Why would you side against me? My son's against me, my daughter's against me, my family's against me, and now the chief priest is against me, so that he has rebelled against me and lies in wait for me as he does today. But Ahimelech's like, wait a minute, what's going on? Ahimelech answered, Who of all your servants is as loyal as David? It's like, what are you talking about? That David isn't in rebellion against you. I mean, his reputation in the community is David is your most loyal subject. Who in your kingdom is more loyal as David, the king's son-in-law, the captain of the king's bodyguard? I mean, you've entrusted this man with your life. Everybody knows how loyal he is to you, and he's highly respected in your household. Was that day, and he says, besides that, this isn't the first time he's come to me for advice. Was that day the first time I inquired of God for him? Of course not. Let not the king accuse your servant or any of his father's family. 4, I don't know anything about this. For your servant knows nothing at all about this whole affair. But the king said, you will surely die, Ahimelech, you and your whole family. Because he's crazy, and he's afraid. He's paranoid. And then the king did something really foolish. Then the king ordered the guards at his side to turn and kill the priests of the Lord because they too had sided with David. But the soldiers, the warriors that traveled with King Saul refused to kill the priest. I mean, we'll kill your enemies. We'll kill prisoners of war. We will kill those that have robbed and stolen from our people, but we're not going to kill the priest of the Lord. But Doeg, the chief herdsman, thinks this is an opportunity for him to get in good with the king, and he raises his hand and he says, if they won't, I will. And Doeg slaughters 85 priests, but Saul isn't finished. He says, now I want all of you to go to Nob, and you are to kill every man, every woman, every child, and every infant. Very few people escape the slaughter. One of them was one of Ahimelech's sons. He flees to David, falls down at his feet, and tells David the entire story. And David is broken. And the text says he says this. He said, I am responsible for the death of your entire family. David was responsible for the death of an entire village. Because taking matters into our own hands, sometimes it feels good. It just doesn't turn out good. Now, we're going to pick up the story of David next time. But I want to ask you 2 or 3 questions real quick as we think about how this intersects with our lives. Because for some of you, honestly, you're thinking, did someone call you and tell you to preach this sermon today? This is unbelievable. And the answer is yes, they did, okay? No, this is just common to all of us. There's going to be a time in all of our lives when our anger pushes us to do things we know we shouldn't do. Or our sense of isolation and loneliness, suddenly we're fantasizing about things that we would tell other people they have no business doing that somehow become live options for us because these emotions are so powerful. So here's the question, what? What is your loneliness, anger, or fear causing you to consider that you've never considered before? Relationally, financially, physically, some sort of risk you would never take before. Maybe the whole idea of re-embracing an old habit that you spent hours and hours or days or weeks or possibly years and thousands of dollars overcoming. Suddenly you find yourself rethinking embracing that habit. What is your loneliness, anger, fear causing you to consider that you've never considered before? And have you ever seen that actually work out for anybody? Or how about this question? Who is your loneliness, anger, or fear causing you to consider that you shouldn't consider? You've never called him back, but you're thinking about calling him back now. You didn't return that call, but you're thinking about calling her back now. She's made it very obvious, he's made it very obvious that there's potential for a relationship, and you've ignored it and ignored it and ignored it. But because of what's going on at home, because of what's going on financially, because of what's going on in some other area of your life, suddenly that's a live option. And you know you have no business doing that. And here is the wake-up call question, all right? This is the question that David completely missed, and we kind of get it. He was 22 years old and by himself. But this was the wake-up call question that I hope will be your wake-up call. Who, besides you, do your considerations put at risk? Who besides you do these options that were never options before, but suddenly they're live options now, who do these options put at risk besides you? And I already know the answer to that question for you. The answer is the people you love the most and the people who love you the most. Some of you know that through personal experience with your family growing up because dad's anger spun out of control and you've been dealing with it ever since. Mom's depression or mom's sense of a loneliness or abandonment just got out of control and she turned to things and you've been dealing with it ever since. It's a son or a daughter. Who else is at risk? Who else's future hangs in the balance of your personal decision to give in to the impulse caused by anger, abandonment, or fear. One last one. What advice? What advice would you give? What advice would you give someone who is you? What would you tell yourself? And isn't it true? When it's someone else, it's so clear. And when it's you, you think you're an exception to the rule. Did you know you're not an exception to the rule? You're a very unique person, but your experience is not unique. You're a very special person. Your experience is not special. You're a one-of-a-kind person, but your experience is not one of a kind. These are well-worn paths. That's why it's so easy to know what other people ought to do. Now, the interesting thing about this question is that we know the advice that David would give us. Not 22-year-old David. Grown-up King David would later give this advice. He would journal it for us. Here's what he would write. He would say, the Lord is a refuge for the oppressed. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed. Not a chemical, not alcohol, not an affair, not another person, not a lot of debt, not a new car, not a new house, not something else that you can lease. The Lord is a refuge. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed. A stronghold. This is a word that we don't get because we don't understand strongholds. A stronghold is a place that you would flee to in times of war. A stronghold in times of trouble. The place you run to, that God is the place you run to. God is the relationship you run to when you feel oppressed, when there's times of trouble. David would tell us, David would say, I took refuge in my ability to control outcomes, and the outcome was a disaster. He would write, those who know your name trust in you, for you, Lord, have never forsaken those who seek you. I thought I had been forsaken, David would say, but I was mistaken. I thought I had been forsaken. I thought this wouldn't be happening to me if God was with me. I felt forsaken, but now that I look back, I realize I wasn't forsaken. God was with me. I felt forsaken, but I was mistaken. You know what he would tell you? He would say, don't make that mistake. And then here's something for those of you who skeptical about Christianity, been there, done that. You're just here because somebody's going to buy you lunch or told you meet somebody cute, or you're having to watch this because you're staying overnight with your family and they watch these silly preaching programs and you're having to sit there with your arms crossed. I just want you to consider this. This is so powerful. You ready? 1,000 years later, 1,000 years after this event, 1,000 years, David's most famous descendant, who was actually born in the city of David, would gaze into the eyes of some frightened, angry, abandoned, overtaxed Israelites. And he would say this. He would say, come to me. He would put himself in the place of the Lord. He would put himself in the place of God. Instead of the Lord as a refuge, Jesus, 1,000 years later, would look at a group of people in that very same part of the world. And he would say, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke, my burden, my perspective, my worldview. Take my yoke on you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. Because when you feel forsaken, you are mistaken. God is with you. That's what Jesus would say. That's what David would tell us. He would say, don't run, don't run, don't run. When Ahimelech brought out the sword of Goliath, that's when I should have remembered. He would say, don't move until you're led. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed, a stronghold in times of trouble, but it's even better than that. The Lord is a refuge for the oppressed. He is your stronghold in times of trouble. Heavenly Father, thank you for this incredible, incredible, incredible narrative that's thousands of years old, and you preserved it for us, and it was as if it was written for us. And I pray for every man, every woman, every teenager, college student, senior adult, single adult, wherever we are in life, Father, if we're 22 like David, or if we're in our 50s like David would eventually be when he would forget once again. Would you just remind us of your past faithfulness? Would you open our eyes to the reality of your involvement in our lives? And Father, for the person that's just so angry they can hardly sit still, that's so afraid that they almost didn't show up today. I pray that your presence, your abiding presence, the fact that we even talked about this today, will be a reminder to them that they have not been forsaken. And I pray that none of us would move without you. In Jesus' name.